Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We love to wade into the really complex and sometimes controversial topics, and today we're going to be tackling one that's been making headlines all across India.
Yeah, this one's got it all. Language, politics, culture, identity. It's a real powder keg.
It sure is. We're talking about the latest flare-up in the long-standing debate over Hindi and Tamil, and this time it all started with Pawan Kalyan, the Telugu film star turned politician.
Right, he really stirred the pot with some comments about Tamil politicians. He basically accused them of rejecting Hindi while happily cashing in on Hindi-dubbed films.
Yeah, his comments were definitely pointed. He even said something like Tamil politicians make crores from Hindi-dubbed films, but they don't want the language in Tamil Nadu.
Oh yeah, he didn't hold back, and the DMK, they were not having it.
No, they fired back pretty quickly. Their spokesperson, Dr. Syed Hafizullah, he made it clear that Tamil Nadu doesn't oppose anyone learning Hindi, but they're absolutely against any kind of forced imposition.
It's really interesting because this goes way beyond just a preference for one language over another. It taps into this deep-seated fear in Tamil Nadu of losing their own language and culture.
That's where the history comes in, right? Like
Yeah.
another DMK leader, TKS Ilangovan, he brought up Tamil Nadu's long history of resisting Hindi imposition.
Hmm.
He even mentioned the 1968 law that essentially upholds this two-language formula in the state, Tamil and English.
Yeah, and he basically called out Kalyan for not really understanding the depth of feeling on this issue. This isn't just some recent political tactic for the DMK. It's something that's been brewing for decades.
Right. So there's this historical baggage that Kalyan maybe didn't fully grasp, but then he went on to make things even more personal. He said that he faced discrimination during student days in Chennai and even claimed that he would protect India's integrity against anyone trying to divide it based on language.
Yeah, you can see how he's trying to frame this as a matter of national unity. A lot of people believe that Hindi should be the primary language that unifies the entire country. But the DMK, they saw this as a political move.
They basically accused him of playing politics and trying to align himself with the BJP for his own gain.
And speaking of the BJP, one of their leaders, Vikram Randhawa, he came out in support of Kalyan's statements.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was pretty vocal about it. He insisted that Hindi should be embraced by everyone and even called it India's national language, which, just for the record, it's not.
Fact check true. India doesn't actually have a designated national language, but his argument was that if southern states are profiting from Hindi films, then they shouldn't resist the language itself.
It's like he was accusing them of hypocrisy.
Yeah, exactly. And, this whole thing ties into the debate over the National Education Policy, the NEP, which was introduced by the BJP government.
Right. M.K. Stalin, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu, he's been a vocal critic of the NEP. He even called it a saffronization policy.
He's worried that it promotes Hindi at the expense of regional languages, and he sees it as a threat to the Tamil Nadu education system and to the diversity of languages in India.
So we've got this really interesting power dynamic at play here. The DMK resisting what they see as North Indian cultural and political dominance, and then you have Kayan, who seems to be aligning himself with the BJP's vision of a more Hindi-centric India.
It's a complex situation for sure, and to really understand it, we need to dig a little deeper into the historical roots of this tension.
So it sounds like this resistance to Hindi in Tamil Nadu runs really deep, huh?
Yeah, it's not just about language itself, it's about identity, about protecting something that feels very personal and very precious to a lot of people. You see, even before India gained independence, there were already concerns in the South, especially in Tamil Nadu, about Hindi potentially becoming the dominant language.
So they were worried about losing their own language and their own culture.
Exactly. And those anxieties really intensified in the 1960s when the newly formed Indian government was trying to establish a sense of national unity, and they made a push to make Hindi the sole official language of the country. And that sparked huge protests in Tamil Nadu, like massive demonstrations. People felt like their cultural identity was being erased, that a language that felt foreign to them was being forced upon them.
So this wasn't just about practicality or convenience. It was a much deeper emotional reaction.
Oh, absolutely. And those protests, they were so powerful that the government eventually had to back down, and they ended up adopting a three-language formula for education. Hindi, English, and the regional language. It was a compromise, but it didn't really erase that mistrust towards any attempts to impose Hindi.
And it's interesting because the DMK, the party that's at the heart of this current debate, they really rose to power on the back of those anti-Hindi agitations.
Right? It's part of their DNA. It's central to their identity as a party. And for a lot of Camels, language is so deeply connected to their sense of self and community. It's not just words, it's their history, it's their traditions, it's what makes them unique.
It makes you realize that language can be a really powerful symbol, can't it?
It absolutely is. And, this kind of tension, it's not unique to India. You see similar things happening all over the world in places with diverse languages. Like think about the debates in Canada with English and French, or in Spain with Catalan and Basque. It's this ongoing struggle between regional identities and the desire for national unity.
So how do we move forward? Is there any way to resolve this, or are we just going to keep having these heated debates about language and identity?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers, but I think a really important first step is to start truly valuing linguistic diversity, to shift away from this idea that different languages are a threat to national unity and start seeing them as a source of strength and cultural richness.
Like a tapestry with all these different threads, each one beautiful and unique, and when they're woven together, they create something really amazing.
Exactly. Imagine a world where kids in India could easily navigate their mother tongue, Hindi and English, not as competing forces, but as tools that work together for communication, education, and understanding each other's cultures.
That's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
But how do we actually bridge the divide that exists right now? How do we move from suspicion and tension to respect and understanding?
Well, it's a long process, but I think it starts with dialogue, with empathy, with being willing to see things from someone else's perspective. We need to remember that language isn't just about practical communication. It's a symbol of who we are and where we belong.
So it's about respecting those differences, not trying to erase them, finding ways to coexist and even thrive in a society that embraces multiple languages.
Absolutely, and that takes real sensitivity and a genuine commitment to inclusivity, making sure that no one feels pushed aside or silenced because of the language they speak.
That sounds ideal. But right now it feels like language is being used as a weapon to divide people more than unite them.
I hear you. It's definitely not easy, but I think it's a goal worth fighting for. Imagine what we could accomplish if we could use the power of language to build bridges instead of walls.
So we've talked about the history and the cultural anxieties, but what about the economics of all this? Kalyan brought up the fact that Tamil films are often dubbed in Hindi. So is there any truth to that? Do Southern film industries actually benefit from reaching those Hindi-speaking audiences?
Oh, absolutely. The Hindi film market is huge. Dubbing films opens them up to a much wider audience, and it can mean serious money at the box office. It's a smart business move. But the DMK, their argument is that that doesn't change their stance against Hindi imposition in other areas like education or government.
So they're drawing a line between the economic aspect and the cultural political one.
Exactly. They're saying, look, we can engage with the Hindi market without compromising our own linguistic identity and our autonomy.
It's a nuanced perspective, but it really does feel like this whole debate is as much about politics as it is about language. The DMK is using it to assert their regional power. And then you have figures like Kalyan who seem to be aligning themselves with the BJP's idea of a more Hindi-centric India.
I think you're right. It's not a simple linguistic debate. It's a power struggle playing out on the political stage, and it's probably going to continue as long as those dynamics are in place.
So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, what's the key takeaway? What should they keep in mind as they navigate this complex landscape?
I think the most important thing is to remember that language is a multifaceted issue, especially in a country as diverse as India. It's not just about communication. It's about identity, culture, and politics and power, and understanding those different layers is really crucial for having thoughtful and informed conversations about these issues.
It's like those heated arguments are sometimes not really about the words themselves, but about the deeper anxieties and desires that they represent.
Absolutely. This clash between Hindi and Tamil is like a microcosm of the bigger tensions that are playing out in India, tensions that we need to address with care and respect if we want to build a truly inclusive and harmonious society.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often turbulent world of language and politics in India.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. Yeah, it really makes you think about how much more is wrapped up in language than just the words themselves.
Oh, for sure. It's about how we see the world, the connections we make, the stories we tell, and especially in a place like India with such a mix of languages and cultures, navigating that can be beautiful, but it can also be really tricky.
You know, we've been focusing on this clash between Hindi and Tamil, but it feels like this tension has been bubbling under the surface for ages.
It definitely has. And you know what's interesting? Even though the specific issues might change, the core concerns are pretty much the same. Like, there's this deep worry in the South that promoting Hindi means pushing aside other languages and culture.
Like it's a threat to who they are.
Yeah, exactly. Like their identity, their history, their sense of self. And then on the flip side, you have people who see Hindi as something that brings everyone together.
Like a way to bridge the gap between different parts of the country and build a stronger national identity.
Exactly. For them, Hindi represents a common language, a shared foundation, and it's a way to feel connected to something bigger than just your own region.
So it's not really just about language, it's about these different ideas of what it means to be Indian.
You got it. And that's what makes this debate so complex and so important because it makes us confront these fundamental questions about identity, power, and belonging in a country that's changing so rapidly.
It's a debate that demands a lot of nuance and empathy, a willingness to really listen to people who see things differently than you do.
Couldn't agree more. It's about finding ways to value and protect the amazing variety of languages in India while also building understanding and connection across those differences.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the big takeaway is that language is never just about language. It's a glimpse into the heart of a culture, a reflection of its history, and a powerful symbol of its identity. And especially in India, where language is so intertwined with politics and culture understanding, that is key to navigating the present and shaping the future.
What a powerful message. It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in creating a more inclusive and harmonious society, one where language brings us together instead of dividing us. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.
My pleasure.
And for our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.